onward and upward to the next step. Next step is to get the transmission out. First step is to remove the transmission coolant lines. The GM engineer that designed the location of these coolant lines should be shot. You can't get to them. They're really difficult. So, without any interruptions, we should make good progress. Well, what was it I was saying about interruptions?
Hello.
These robocallers should be shot. So let's get these coolant lines out, and then I'll explain to you why removing the blower was a mistake. The next thing is the torque converter bolts. In order to remove the torque converter bolts, you have to be able to rotate the engine. And the upper blower pulley can be used to rotate the engine. But I removed the blower. So the only way I can do that is to get to the crankshaft bolt. And in order to get to the crankshaft bolt, I have to disassemble the whole lower end of the motor. So the first thing we got to take off is the fuel pump drive belt. You know, I'm going to have to take that off eventually anyway, aren't I? Gotta take that off, gotta take that off. Gotta take that off. So what we've decided to take off here is the mechanical positive displacement fuel pump. It's going to have to come off anyway, so we might as well take it off now. And I'm going to have to take this ground wire off because it runs through the lines for the fuel pump. So now that we've got that out of the way, we can go back to taking the lower belt pulley off, and that will expose the crankshaft bolt. And we can use the crankshaft bolt to turn the motor over so we can position it so that we can get to the torque converter bolts. Now the torque converter bolts on a Pontiac are particularly hard to get to. So that's the next step. Alright. Well, I should clarify that. The reason these bolts are hard to get to on this Pontiac is because of the mid plate. And the mid plate covers the whole front of the flex plate. So there's only one small area that you can get to the heads of the torque converter bolts. And I found the easiest way to do that is to use a long extension, which you've seen here. You gotta be kidding me. Not another phone call. Well, at least it wasn't a robocall.
Hello.
Okay, the phone interruption made me think, and I gave up on the ratchet, and I went with Tim Taylor, and I think more power is the way to go, so we're going to use an air impact. There's 6 of these bolts that have to come out. The reason there's 6 on this motor rather than the typical 3 is in Norwalk in the final round I sheared all 3 of the bolts and lost the round. So we doubled up on the bolts and now we have 6. So we've got all 6 of the bolts out, and now what we got to do is push the torque converter back away from the flex plate so that we can lift the transmission out. So that's what we're doing here. Here's the 6 bolts. It's hard to believe you could shear these things. Well, there were only 3 at the time. They're grade 8 bolts, and good quality grade 8 bolts. Okay, so now we're getting close. We got everything that holds the transmission to the chassis disconnected except for the bell housing bolts. And we're going to take everything out but 2 bolts, and then it'll be ready to come out. Now, one of the great things that was done when this chassis was built, and by the way, Keith Bergen of Ruman Motorsports built the chassis, is he designed it so the transmission could come out through the top. That means old fogies like myself don't have to pick the transmission up to get it out.
No, you're not ready?
Yeah.
Do you want me to put those? Oh, it fell.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Jack a little bit. Come on out of there. Stupid thing. Don't touch anything.
I'm not touching anything. I'm looking with my eyeballs. My eyeballs can't do anything.
The torque converter is stuck on the flex plate. Let's give it a little nudge. That's not what I wanted.
Nope.
So what did they say about best laid plans? I guess this old fogey is going to have to pick this transmission up. Well, a lot of the weight is going to be supported by the engine hoist, so that helps. Okay, stop. Okay, go. Stop. Go.
Oh, it came off.
Keep going. Hold it. Okay.
Oh, wait, you're not quite there.
Put it down.
How?
Alright, well, you gotta be real careful. Right there. Turn it slow. I had wanted to avoid the torque converter coming out of the front of this transmission for a number of reasons. To re-engage the torque converter, there's generally 3 steps it has to go through. That was the first 2. The 3 steps are 2 splines and then the pump. Now, for some reason, this transmission is extremely difficult to get the spline on the torque converter to engage the pump. And you definitely don't want to put the transmission on a motor without having that torque converter engaged with the pump, because you ruin the pump. The only true test to check that make sure it's all the way in is to measure it and make sure that it is far back as the flex plate protrudes from the back of the engine. Now, I'm going to have to replace the seal because I'm sure the seal has been tweaked, but that's an easy job and we can do that another day. So now, transmission's out. Time to take the engine out. Now, it's hard to believe that these clamps are what hold the front of the motor down, but they're aircraft clamps, so they are special clamps. So we got the second one off. So the front of the engine is disconnected. We'll get the spark plug wires up out of the way. We'll disconnect the lower boost sensor and the temperature sensor. And now what we're going to have to do is take the flex plate bolts out. These are 12-point bolts, and I think they're torqued to 95 foot-pounds. I've forgotten, but that's about right. See the scoring on the mid plate? That's what happened when the flex plate bolts sheared at Norwalk. Don't want to lose these bolts. They're special bolts from ARP and they weren't cheap. Okay, now we got to remove the coil. And the reason we got to move the coil is because we got to be able to get to the bolt holes to put the engine lift chain into the bolt hole. You have to be careful with these bolts on the end of the coil, as they're almost impossible to find. So next we'll unbolt the bracket that holds the coil on. Once again, these are 12-point bolts and 3/8, and I really like that because that means 90% of the bolts on the motor use the same wrench, and when I'm in a hurry at the track, that means I don't have to track down a bunch of wrenches. With the coil off, the next job will be to get the wires through the mid plate. Now I have 4 wires going through this one hole. I tried to keep as few holes in the mid plate as possible for fire prevention. Don't want fire to protrude into my feet. So I got to take the smallest wires through first, and I'm going to end up with 1 wire, and the 1 wire has a 4-prong connector on it, and unfortunately it won't go through the hole. Now I use weather pack connectors, and I really like weather pack connectors, and I'm going to have to make a video on how to use these things because it makes them reusable. What I'm doing here is writing down the color codes and the positions of the wires, and then you use a tubular tool to push the pin out the back of the jack, and the wire just comes out. Now it's nice you can reuse these plugs and reconfigure them. So now we got all the wires out of the plug. We pull the wire through the hole, and now we stick the wires back into the plug, and the plug is again reusable. So I swear by these things. They're wonderful, and they're sealed pretty well against weather, so they don't corrode. They're excellent. I highly recommend them, and I will be doing a video on those to show how they go together. So now we're going to move to the front corner of the engine, and what we have here is an expansion tank. But the expansion tank also does the job of getting all the air out of the block. The lower pipe in the expansion tank goes into the low pressure side of the pump and is sucking water out of the tank, and the upper pipe goes in the highest part of the block, so water comes into the tank all the time, and if there's air in the cooling system, it goes into the top of the tank, and water is sucked out of the bottom of the tank, so it removes all the air from the coolant system. It was a nice setup. Missouri water pump actually had a diagram on it. It's no longer on the website. So now we got the tank off. And oh, by the way, the new engine won't have any coolant at all. I'll be selling the tank and the pump. It's a Missouri water pump with the engine. So now we're clipping wire ties off. That's the return fuel line. This is the throttle cable. That's the primer line that we talked about earlier. Actually, we talked about it in the last video. And that's the feed line. I think I'm going to have to go to a larger feed line. This thing will chew up about 2.5 to 3 gallons of fuel in 1/4 mile run. So the new engine should use more than that. This is one of 4 nozzles that make up the fire retardant system on the Dragster. I think it's free. Got to take the remote oil filter off. And then I think that motor's ready to lift out of there. I think it is. So let's get the oil filter out. Now, I'm probably going to use the same remote oil filter on the new engine. If nothing else, I'm going to use the bracket. I may just buy another System 1 oil filter so that I can sell this motor complete, completely complete. I have to face that problem in the future. These remote oil filters are not cheap. I think we're ready to start to try to lift it. I built this engine cradle. Actually, I built two of them now. We've got this one, we've got that one over there. I ended up building this one because that one was up at Freedom Racing Engines. And we broke the crankshaft in half on this motor at the Hot Rod Reunion this summer. And I had to pull it out and put it someplace. So I built this cradle to put the motor in it when we took it out to repair the damage. We were extremely lucky in that it didn't really do any damage other than break the crankshaft in half. And I actually built part of my son's Christmas gift out of the broken, half of the broken crankshaft. And I'll put that link to that build in the upper corner of this video. So this cradle fits this motor perfect. Something else I've done that's helpful is you always want to get these links even. And it's always a pain because you gotta count them. So what I did is I painted the links that were right. So they're equal distance apart. So I've got the center painted and I've got the ends painted so I don't have to count links. So another thing I did is in the cradle I put the bolts that are needed to lift the motor out. I've done that in both cradles. So let's put this in. I just tap the bars. So black is 11 links. Now some people will lift this thing off using a boom or intake. I don't like doing that. I'm gonna put it in this hole. Now, hopefully we don't drop this thing like we dropped the transmission. That was a no good thing. Clear. Okay, do I put the oil pump on the outside or the inside? I think we put it on the outside.
Now, in these uprights, I got holes drilled for the dowel pins. And then bolt holes where I can pull the motor up to the cradle. And once those bolts are in, that motor cannot move on the cradle. Figure out what to do with that in a minute. And the engine's out. This engine is the series rate winning engine in the 8 class, 8 index class, extremely tunable. I think I'm going to sell it. I'm going to sell it complete. That means blower, pump, filter, exhaust, ignition, complete. This thing was just rebuilt this summer. It's got a brand new crank in it, got brand new rods in it, aluminum rods. I'll probably be listing it on Racing Junk. And when I do, I'll take pictures of it all together and I'll put a link in. But for now, I got a big hole. I'm really anxious to put that one in, but I want to paint that first. I'm going to paint that one the same way this one's painted. I know that's a sin to paint aluminum, but that's Pontiac blue. It goes real nice with the green. I'll do the valve covers in the gold. So really the only difference you're going to see is the mag and the fuel pump coming out the front.
If you enjoyed the video, would you do me the favor of clicking the like and subscribing? Thank you.
I don't know if that got some. We'll do this way. Okay.
Have a good day.